Do you want to know who Pygmalion and Galatea were? To answer this question, we have to dive deep into one of the most enchanting and mysterious love stories in all of Greek mythology. A tale about an artist who refused the world, a statue carved with impossible perfection, and a miracle granted by the gods themselves. But before we begin, a quick reminder to subscribe and leave a like if you enjoy these mythological journeys. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the story.
A sculptor disillusioned by love. On the sun-drenched island of Cyprus, where the Mediterranean waves crashed against white limestone cliffs and the air was heavy with the scent of wild herbs and flowers, there lived a sculptor whose name would echo through the ages not for his artistry alone, but for the extraordinary transformation that love and divine intervention would work upon his life. This was Pygmalion, a man of exceptional talent, whose hands could coax beauty from lifeless stone with such mastery that even the gods themselves took notice of his work. His workshop, located in the heart of the island that was sacred to Aphrodite herself, was filled with marble figures of such exquisite detail that visitors often claim they could see the statues breathe, that at any moment these frozen forms might step down from their pedestals and walk among the living. Pygmalion had been blessed with every gift the gods could bestow upon an artist. A keen eye that could perceive beauty in its purest forms, hands that never trembled or erred in their precise movements, an imagination that conceived of figures more perfect than nature itself, and the patience to spend months or even years bringing a single vision to completion. His reputation spread throughout Cyprus and beyond, bringing him wealth, commissions from the most powerful families, and the admiration of everyone who witnessed his creations. But despite all these blessings, despite the success and acclaim that surrounded him, Pygmalion was profoundly unhappy. And the source of his unhappiness was not his art, but rather his complete disillusionment with the prospect of love. He had observed the women of Cyprus with growing disappointment, and eventually with something approaching contempt. He saw vanity where he sought depth, cruelty disguised as beauty, manipulation presented as charm, and a kind of moral corruption that seemed to infect even the most outwardly lovely of his female contemporaries. Perhaps he had been personally wounded by rejection or betrayal at some point in his youth, though the ancient sources do not specify this. Or perhaps his perfectionist nature, which served him so well in his art, made him impossible to satisfy when it came to human relationships, for he applied the same exacting standards to potential romantic partners that he applied to his sculptures, and no living woman could match the flawless ideals that existed in his imagination. The women he encountered seemed to him to be obsessed with trivial matters, concerned only with their appearance and social status, engaged in petty competitions and jealousies, and utterly lacking in the nobility of spirit and purity of heart that he believed should accompany physical beauty. He witnessed marriages based on calculation rather than affection, saw how women manipulated men for wealth and position, and heard the gossip and cruel remarks that passed between women who pretended friendship while harboring resentment. Whether his perceptions were accurate or distorted by his own psychological issues is impossible to say, but the effect on Pygmalion was undeniable. He withdrew from all prospect of romantic involvement, declared that he would never marry and announced that no mortal woman could ever match the perfection he could create with his own hands in marble and ivory. His friends and family likely thought this was merely the temporary bitterness of a young man nursing some romantic disappointment, that time would heal his wounds and he would eventually open his heart again. But as years passed and Pygmalion only became more entrenched in his position, more isolated from normal social life, and more devoted to his art as a substitute for human connection, it became clear that this was not a passing phase, but a fundamental reorientation of his entire existence. He would seek in stone what he could not find in flesh, would create with his hands the companion his heart desired, and would live alone with his art rather than compromise his ideals by accepting a real woman with real flaws. This decision, born of disappointment and pride, and perhaps a touch of misogyny, would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything Pygmalion believed about love, beauty, and the relationship between art and life.
Part 1. Pygmalion's Isolation from the World. As Pygmalion retreated from society and from any possibility of romantic involvement, his workshop became his entire world, a sanctuary where he could exercise complete control and where nothing existed that he had not himself created or chosen. The space was large and filled with natural light that streamed through high windows, illuminating the white marble dust that floated perpetually in the air like snow that never settled. Blocks of uncarved stone stood against the walls, waiting for his vision to release the forms hidden within them. Finished statues occupied pedestals throughout the room, silent witnesses to his skill. Gods and heroes, nymphs and athletes, each one a masterpiece that had brought him fame and fortune. His tools hung in precise arrangements, each chisel and hammer and rasp in its designated place, for Pygmalion was a man who demanded order in his environment as rigorously as he demanded perfection in his art. He lived a life of strict routine and self-imposed discipline, rising before dawn to work in the soft morning light, pausing only briefly for simple meals, and continuing until exhaustion forced him to stop. He had servants who brought him food and maintained his household, but he spoke to them only when necessary, giving instructions in brief, distracted tones, his mind always on the work at hand. Friends who had once been close gradually gave up trying to draw him out, tired of being rebuffed or ignored, and eventually Pygmalion was left almost entirely alone with his marble companions. The city continued around him, full of life and noise and human drama, but he moved through it like a ghost, present but not participating, acknowledged but not engaged. People admired his work and commissioned new pieces, but they stopped trying to know the man behind the art. Pygmalion's reputation grew, even as his humanity seemed to diminish. He was spoken of with respect, but also with a certain unease, for there was something unsettling about a man who preferred stone to living flesh, who seemed to have no need for the warmth of human connection, who poured all his passion and emotion into creations that could never love him back. Some whispered that he had been cursed by Aphrodite for rejecting love, though others countered that if the goddess had truly been offended, she would have taken away his artistic gift rather than leaving it intact. The truth was that Pygmalion had chosen this isolation deliberately, had constructed these walls around himself, as carefully as he carved his statues, believing that solitude was preferable to the disappointment he associated with human relationships. In his workshop, everything was under his control. The statues never disappointed him, never revealed flaws of character or behavior that would shatter his illusions. They remained eternally beautiful, eternally perfect, frozen in moments of ideal grace that no living being could sustain. But as the years passed and his isolation deepened, something began to shift in Pygmalion's consciousness. The satisfaction he had once found in his work became tinged with a melancholy he could not quite name. He would complete a statue and feel not triumph, but a strange emptiness, as though something essential was missing from even his finest creations. He began to dream, not the ordinary confused dreams of sleep, but vivid waking visions of a woman who embodied everything he had ever believed beauty could be, both physical and spiritual. This woman existed nowhere in the real world, perhaps never had existed and would never exist. But in his imagination, she was utterly clear and complete. He could see every detail of her face, the exact curve of her smile, the particular grace of her movements, the depth of understanding in her eyes. She was not just physically beautiful, but possessed a nobility of spirit, a kindness, a purity that he had never encountered in any living woman. This vision began to obsess him, appearing in his thoughts during his waking hours and in his dreams at night, until Pygmalion realized, with a mixture of excitement and despair, that he had to try to capture her in stone, to bring her from the realm of imagination into some kind of tangible existence, even if she could never truly live. This decision marked a turning point, for it represented not just another commission or artistic challenge, rather an attempt to create the impossible, to manifest in physical form the perfect companion his heart desires, even though he knew that stone could never breathe or speak or return the love he found himself already feeling for this creature of his imagination.
Part 2. The creation of the perfect statue. Pygmalion approached this new project with a dedication that surpassed anything he had ever brought to his art before. This would not be merely a sculpture, but rather an act of devotion, an attempt to pour his entire soul into the creation of something that transcended mere craftsmanship to become a kind of miracle. He rejected marble for this work, deciding instead to use ivory, a material more rare and precious, warmer in tone and texture, capable of capturing the subtle variations of human skin in ways that cold white marble never could. He acquired the finest ivory available, great tusks brought from distant lands at enormous expense, and he selected the pieces with meticulous care, examining each one for flaws or imperfections that might mar the final work. Once he had his materials assembled, he cleared his workshop of all other projects, refusing new commissions and abandoning half-finished works to focus entirely on this single statue. He began with drawings in small clay models, working out every proportion and angle, studying the vision that haunted his imagination and trying to capture it first in these preliminary forms. But these sketches and models were merely preparation for the main work, and when he finally took chisel to ivory, it was with a sense that he was embarking on something that would define the rest of his life. The work proceeded slowly, for he refused to rush any aspect of the creation, refused to accept even the smallest deviation from the perfection he envisioned. Each day he would work for hours,
his movements precise and controlled, removing ivory in tiny increments, constantly stepping back to assess the emerging form from different angles and in different lights. Days became weeks, and weeks became months, and still the statue was not complete, for Pygmalion was creating not just a body, but attempting to capture something ineffable, some quality of spirit that would make this figure more than merely beautiful. He shaped her face with infinite care, spending weeks on the curve of her lips alone, trying to capture a smile that was both serene and inviting, knowing and innocent, a smile that suggested depths of character and warmth of spirit. Her eyes, though they were sightless ivory, seemed to hold a kind of awareness, a gentle intelligence that looked out at the world with compassion rather than judgment. Her hair flowed down her shoulders in waves that seemed to move, even though they were frozen in stone, each strand individually carved with such delicacy that viewers would later swear they could see it ripple in unseen breezes. Her body was shaped with equal care, modest yet graceful, neither overly voluptuous nor ascetically thin, but rather perfectly proportioned in ways that suggested health and vitality. He positioned her in a stance that was natural and relaxed, not the formal poses typical of statuary, but rather as though she had been captured in a moment of ordinary movement, perhaps just turning to greet someone. Her weight shifted slightly to one leg, her hands positioned as though she had just been reaching for something or gesturing in conversation. As the statue neared completion, Pygmalion found himself working even more slowly, almost reluctant to finish, because completion would mean admitting that this was the limit of what he could achieve, that no amount of additional work could bridge the gap between art and life. But finally, after months of obsessive labor, after countless hours of the most detailed carving imaginable, the statue was complete. He stood back and looked at what he had created, and even he who had conceived and executed the work was struck by what he saw. The figure before him was more beautiful than anything he had ever created, more beautiful perhaps than any sculpture that had ever existed. She was not just technically perfect, but possessed a kind of living quality that transcended mere craftsmanship, as though at any moment she might take a breath or speak. He named her Galatea, a name that meant whiteness or milk white, reflecting the ivory from which she was carved, but also suggesting a kind of purity and perfection. When he finally allowed others to see the completed statue, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. People came from across Cyprus to view her, and they stood before Galatea in stunned silence, struggling to find words adequate to describe what they were seeing. Some claimed she was too beautiful, that her perfection was almost unsettling because it reminded them too sharply of their own imperfections. Others wept openly, moved by something in her expression or stance that spoke to deep places in their hearts. But while everyone else saw an extraordinary work of art, Pygmalion saw something more, something that troubled and exhilarated him in equal measure. He saw the woman he loved.
Part 3. Obsession turns to love. After the statue was completed and the initial excitement of its unveiling had passed, after the visitors had come and gone and left Pygmalion alone once more in his workshop, something strange began to happen. Something that started as artistic appreciation but gradually transformed into something far more complicated and troubling. Pygmalion found himself unable to stop looking at Galatea, unable to focus on any other work or any other aspect of his life. He would stand before her for hours, studying every detail of her form, admiring his own craftsmanship, certainly, but also feeling something deeper,
something that went beyond pride in his artistic achievement to become a genuine emotional attachment. At first, he told himself this was natural, that any artist would feel connected to their greatest creation. But as days passed, he had to admit that what he felt was not mere attachment, but rather love in its fullest and most troubling sense. He began to treat the statue not as an artwork, but as though she were a living woman, a presence in his workshop and his life. He brought fine clothes and dressed her in flowing robes of the softest linen, dyed in colors that complemented the warm tones of the ivory. He commissioned jewelry for her and adorned her with necklaces, bracelets, and rings, taking pleasure in how these ornaments enhanced her beauty. He brought flowers and placed them in her hands or wove them into her carved hair, even though he knew she could neither smell their fragrance nor appreciate their colors. He would speak to her, at first perhaps just thinking aloud as he worked, but gradually engaging in longer and more intimate conversations, telling her about his day, sharing his thoughts and feelings, confessing fears and hopes he had never spoken aloud to any living person. In the silence of his workshop, he would imagine her responses, would convince himself that her expression shifted slightly in reaction to his words, that her ivory lips curved into a smile when he said something that pleased her. The rational part of his mind knew that this was delusion, that he was projecting his own desires onto an inanimate object, but the emotional part of his heart insisted that Galatea was real in some essential way, that the love he felt for her was genuine, even if she could not return it. He began to engage in behaviors that even he recognized as bizarre and troubling. He would kiss her lips, cold and unyielding ivory that warmed only slightly from his breath, and he would imagine that they grew softer, more responsive. He would embrace her, wrapping his arms around her rigid form, pressing his cheek against her smooth shoulder, trying to pretend that he felt warmth and softness rather than the hard reality of carved material. At night, he began bringing her into his sleeping chamber, positioning the statue beside his bed so that she would be the last thing he saw before sleep and the first thing upon waking. He would lie awake talking to her in the darkness, pouring out his loneliness and his longing, asking her why she could not be real, begging her to somehow come alive and release him from this torment of loving something that could never love him back. His servants noticed his strange behavior and whispered among themselves, concerned and perhaps a bit frightened by what was happening to their master. Friends who still occasionally visited were shocked by the change in him, by how he spoke to and about the statue as though she were a real person, and they tried gently to suggest that perhaps he was becoming too attached to his creation, that it might be healthy to complete the commission, deliver it to whatever patron had ordered it, or donate it to a temple, and move on to other work. But Pygmalion reacted to these suggestions with anger and possessiveness, making it clear that Galatea would never leave his workshop, that no one would ever take her from him, that she was not merely a statue but rather the only woman he had ever truly loved or would ever love. He was trapped in a paradox of his own creation. He had made Galatea to embody his ideal of perfect womanhood, and she did embody it, but precisely because she was perfect and unchanging, she could never truly be his companion, could never grow or respond and share the life he longed to live with her. He had created the solution to his loneliness, but in a form that only deepened that loneliness. For how much more painful is it to be close to exactly what you want, but unable to truly possess it, than to simply be alone? Pygmalion's emotional state deteriorated as this love without reciprocation consumed him, and he found himself torn between hope and despair, between the moments when he could lose himself in the fantasy that Galatea was real and the crushing returns to reality when he had to acknowledge that he was in love with lifeless ivory.
Part 4. The Festival of Aphrodite. The annual festival honoring Aphrodite arrived as it did every year, a great celebration that filled Cyprus with music, dancing, processions, and prayers. The festival was especially important on this island, for Cyprus was one of the primary centers of Aphrodite's worship, the place where she had emerged from the sea foam after her birth, and the goddess was believed to take particular interest in events and prayers originating from this sacred land. Throughout the island, temples were decorated with flowers and filled with the smoke of incense, while couples came to pray for blessings on their relationships, for fertility, for harmony in marriage, or for help in finding suitable partners. The air was filled with the sound of hymns praising the goddess of love and beauty, and everywhere there was an atmosphere of joy and celebration as people honored the divine force that drew hearts together and made life worth living. Pygmalion had always avoided this festival in the past, finding it painful to be surrounded by couples celebrating love when he believed himself incapable of finding it. But this year was different. This year he was not simply alone, but rather desperately in love with someone who could not love him back, and his suffering had reached a point where he was willing to humble himself before the gods in a way he never had before. As the festival reached its height, Pygmalion made his way to Aphrodite's temple, joining the crowds of worshippers but feeling utterly separate from them, isolated by the strangeness of his situation and the shame he felt about what he was experiencing. He watched couples pray together, their hands intertwined, asking the goddess to preserve their love or bless them with children, and he felt a mixture of envy and despair. He saw young men and women praying for help in attracting the objects of their affections, and he thought how simple their desires were compared to his own impossible longing. As the day turned to evening and the crowds began to thin, Pygmalion remained in the temple, waiting until he was nearly alone before approaching Aphrodite's altar. He knelt before the golden statue of the goddess, and in the flickering light of oil lamps, he tried to find words for what he wanted to say. His prayer was hesitant and ashamed, for he knew how strange his request would sound, how pitiful he must seem to a goddess who presided over passionate unions between living beings. He did not dare ask directly for what he truly desired, did not have the courage to say outright that he wanted his ivory statue to become a living woman, for such a request seemed too presumptuous, too obviously impossible. Instead, he chose his words carefully, trying to frame his desire in terms that might be granted. He asked for a bride who would be as real and living as his statue was beautiful, someone who matched the perfection he had carved in ivory, but who possessed the warmth and breath and responsiveness of actual life. It was a careful prayer, simultaneously expressing his desire while acknowledging the boundary between art and reality, asking for something that seemed possible, even while knowing that what he truly desired was a miracle. As he knelt there in the gathering darkness, speaking his prayer in a voice barely above a whisper, something extraordinary happened. The flame on Aphrodite's altar suddenly leapt upward, flaring 3 times with unusual intensity, a sign that was universally recognized as indicating that a prayer had been heard and accepted by the goddess. Pygmalion saw this, and his heart began to race with a mixture of hope and terror. Did this mean his prayer would be answered? But how could it be when what he truly desired was impossible? He rose from his knees feeling shaken and uncertain, not quite believing that anything would actually change, but unable to suppress the hope that had ignited in his chest. Aphrodite, watching from her divine realm, had indeed heard his prayer. And more than that, she had understood what he truly desired beneath the careful wording. The goddess of love, who had seen countless prayers and requests over the eons, was moved by something in Pygmalion's situation. Perhaps it was the genuine depth of his love, even if that love was directed toward an object of his own creation. Perhaps it was the recognition that his loneliness and longing were real, regardless of how unconventional their expression. Or perhaps Aphrodite saw in this situation an opportunity to demonstrate her power, to show that love itself could transcend the boundaries between art and life, between the created and the creator. Whatever her reasons, the goddess decided to grant not what Pygmalion had carefully asked for, but rather what his heart truly desired. And she set in motion a miracle that would transform not just the statue, but Pygmalion's entire understanding of love and life.
Part 5. The Miracle of Life. Pygmalion left the temple and returned to his workshop, with his heart heavy with confused emotions, not quite believing that anything would change, yet unable to suppress a desperate hope that somehow his prayer might be answered. When he entered his workshop, everything looked exactly as he had left it. The tools hanging in their places, the marble dust floating in the air, and Galatea standing on her pedestal exactly where she always stood, as beautiful and as lifeless as ever. The rational part of his mind told him that he had been foolish to hope, that goddesses did not grant miracles to men who fell in love with statues, that he would have to find a way to accept his situation and move forward with his life. But as he approached Galatea, as he prepared to perhaps apologize to her for his foolish hopes, something made him reach out and touch her hand, that familiar gesture he had performed countless times before, always feeling nothing but cold, hard ivory. But this time, something was different. Instead of the unyielding coldness he expected, he felt warmth beneath his fingertips, a subtle but unmistakable heat that could only come from living flesh. He jerked his hand back in shock, convinced that he must be imagining it, that his desperate desire was creating illusions. He reached out again, more deliberately this time, placing his palm against her arm, and again he felt warmth, and more than warmth, he felt a softness that had never been there before, as though the ivory was transforming beneath his touch from rigid stone into yielding flesh. His eyes, which had been focused on his hand, traveled upward to her face, and what he saw there made his breath catch in his throat. Color was spreading across the ivory surface like dawn spreading across a white sky. A faint blush appeared in her cheeks, her lips shifted from white to a soft pink, and as he watched in amazement, her closed eyelids began to flutter. He stood frozen, afraid to move or speak or even breathe, terrified that any action on his part might break whatever spell was occurring. The transformation continued, spreading from her face down through her entire body. Her skin warmed and softened. Her hair, which had been carved ivory, became actual strands of hair that moved when he breathed near them. Her body lost its rigid stillness and gained the subtle movements of a living being. And then, most miraculous of all, her chest rose slightly, drawing in breath for the first time, and her eyes opened. Those eyes which Pygmalion had carved to be the windows into a beautiful soul now truly were windows, for they were alive and aware and looking directly at him with an expression that combined curiosity, recognition, and something that might have been love. Galatea blinked, taking in her first conscious view of the world, and her gaze settled on Pygmalion's face, on this man who had created her and loved her before she even lived. Her lips, now soft and mobile, curved into a smile, and when she spoke her first words, her voice was soft and musical, exactly as Pygmalion had imagined it would be in his countless one-sided conversations with her. She said something simple, perhaps just his name, or perhaps asking who he was or where she was. But the exact words mattered less than the fact that she was speaking at all, that she was alive and aware and present before him. Pygmalion, who had maintained his composure through years of loneliness and months of loving a lifeless statue, finally lost control of his emotions. He collapsed to his knees before her, tears streaming down his face, overwhelmed by gratitude and joy and disbelief at what was happening. He reached out to touch her again, and this time she responded, taking his hand in hers, her grip warm and real and
everything he had dreamed of. At that moment, Aphrodite herself appeared in the workshop, manifesting in her divine glory. Or perhaps she simply sent a sign of her presence, a sudden brightening of the light, or a scent of roses that filled the air. The goddess spoke either in words that echoed through the space or directly into Pygmalion's mind, confirming what had happened and blessing the union between the sculptor and his creation. She reminded Pygmalion that this gift was given not because he had earned it or deserved it, but rather because true love, even when directed in unconventional ways, had the power to move the gods. She warned him, or perhaps simply advised him, that Galatea, though she had been created by his hands according to his ideals, was now a living woman with her own will and her own soul, and that he must love her not as a creation, but as an equal, not as something he owned, but as someone who chose to be with him. And then the goddess departed, leaving Pygmalion and Galatea alone together in the workshop that had been the site of both his greatest artistic achievement and his deepest loneliness, but which would now become the birthplace of their shared life.
Part 6. Galatea's Awakening to the World. The first days and weeks of Galatea's life were filled with wonder and discovery, for she had to learn everything that other people absorbed gradually from infancy through childhood, compressed into the experience of an adult consciousness encountering the world for the first time. Pygmalion watched over her with a mixture of protectiveness and amazement, guiding her through the basics of existence: how to walk, though her legs knew the movement instinctively; how to speak, though language came to her with surprising ease, as though the goddess had gifted her not just with life, but with the knowledge necessary to function in the world; how to eat and drink and perform all the ordinary activities of daily living. Galatea approached everything with a sense of curiosity and delight that reminded Pygmalion of children discovering their first flowers or tasting their first fruits. She would examine ordinary objects with intense interest, asking questions about their purpose and origin, marveling at textures and colors and tastes. The world that Pygmalion had come to see as mundane or even disappointing was revealed to Galatea as endlessly fascinating, and through her eyes he began to see it anew. She was gentle and kind, just as he had imagined she would be, but she was also much more than the projection of his ideals. As her personality developed and emerged, he discovered that she had thoughts and preferences of her own, that she was not simply a reflection of what he wanted, but rather a distinct individual with her own nature. She was curious about everything, asking endless questions about the world, about Cyprus, about the gods, about Pygmalion's life before she came alive. She was compassionate, showing concern for the servants in the household, and even for the birds and animals she encountered. She had a sense of humor that sometimes surprised him, laughing at things he had not intended to be funny, or making observations that showed a wit he had not anticipated. And most importantly, she was genuinely interested in him, not just because he had created her, but because she seemed to find him fascinating and worthy of her attention. The love that developed between them was not the one-sided obsession Pygmalion had experienced with the statue, but rather something mutual and reciprocal, a genuine connection between two individuals. Galatea was grateful to him for having created her and brought her into existence, and there was certainly an element of that gratitude in her feelings toward him, but it was not mere gratitude alone. She chose to love him, and that choice made all the difference, transforming what had been a fantasy into a real relationship. As news of the miracle spread throughout Cyprus,
people came to see Galatea and to witness the evidence of divine intervention in their midst. The story of the sculptor who loved his statue so much that Aphrodite brought it to life captured the imagination of everyone who heard it, and the couple became famous throughout the island and beyond. Some came out of simple curiosity, wanting to see the woman who had been ivory and was now flesh. Others came seeking signs of the miracle, looking for evidence that would confirm or deny the story. Still others came to receive blessing, believing that a couple so clearly favored by Aphrodite might bring good fortune to those who honored them. Galatea handled all this attention with grace and patience, though Pygmalion sometimes had to restrain his protective instincts, wanting to shield her from prying eyes and intrusive questions. But Galatea insisted that she wanted to meet people, to understand the world she had been brought into, and gradually she developed relationships of her own, friendships with other women in the city, who taught her the social customs and traditions she needed to know. The people of Cyprus celebrated the miracle, seeing in it a sign that the gods still paid attention to human affairs, that love could overcome even the boundary between art and life, and that their island, already sacred to Aphrodite, had been blessed with a visible demonstration of the goddess's power and mercy.
Part 7. Marriage and Divine Blessing. When enough time had passed for Galatea to become fully comfortable in her new existence, when the initial amazement at the miracle had settled into a more sustainable appreciation, Pygmalion asked her to marry him, and Galatea, who had come to love him not just as her creator, but as a man worthy of love for his own qualities, agreed. The wedding was a grand celebration, attended by people from across Cyprus and blessed directly by Aphrodite herself, who took a personal interest in this union that had resulted from her intervention. The goddess ensured that their marriage would be harmonious and lasting, protecting it from the jealousies and conflicts that so often plagued mortal relationships. The ceremony took place at Aphrodite's temple, the same place where Pygmalion had knelt and prayed for a miracle, and now he stood there with that miracle beside him, ready to pledge his life to her before gods and mortals alike. The priests who officiated the ceremony spoke of how the gods sometimes granted extraordinary gifts to mortals who loved truly and deeply, how art and devotion could combine to create something that transcended both, and how the love between Pygmalion and Galatea would stand as an example for all future generations of what was possible when the human heart and divine power worked together. Pygmalion, standing beside Galatea and looking at her in her wedding robes, adorned with flowers and jewels but more beautiful than any ornament, reflected on how completely his life had been transformed. He had been a man who rejected love, who believed no real woman could match his ideals, who had chosen isolation and art over the messiness of human relationships. But now he understood that he had been wrong, not about the imperfections of mortal women, but about the nature of love itself. True love, he now realized, was not about finding someone who matched an impossible ideal, but rather about choosing to love a real person with all their complexities and contradictions. Galatea, though she had begun as his attempt to create perfection, had become real in every sense. And in becoming real, she had become imperfect in small ways, developing preferences and opinions that sometimes differed from his own, showing emotions that ranged beyond the serene beauty he had carved into her ivory face. But these imperfections, these signs of her genuine humanity, made her more lovable, not less, and Pygmalion found that he loved the real Galatea far more than he had loved the statue, precisely because she could love him back, could choose him, could grow and change and surprise him. After the wedding ceremony, the celebrations continued for days, and when they finally ended and Pygmalion and Galatea settled into their life together,
they found a happiness that neither had expected. In some versions of the myth, Galatea bore a child, a daughter named Paphos, who would grow up to be especially sacred to Aphrodite, and who would give her name to a city on Cyprus that became one of the primary centers of the goddess's worship. This child, born of the union between a mortal man and a woman who had been created as art and transformed into life by divine intervention, carried in her blood the mark of the miraculous, and she would be blessed throughout her life with the special favor of the goddess of love. Pygmalion's artistic career continued, and he created many more statues over the years, but none of them ever approached the perfection of Galatea, for how could they, when she had transcended art to become something greater? But more importantly, Pygmalion discovered that he no longer needed to seek perfection in his art, for he had learned that perfection was not the point. The value of life lay not in achieving some impossible ideal, but in the messy, complicated, wonderful reality of loving and being loved by a real person. His later works showed a new quality, a warmth and humanity that had been missing from his earlier pieces, which for all their technical perfection had been somehow cold. Now his sculptures seemed to capture not just the appearance of his subjects, but something of their inner life, their character and personality. And people said that Aphrodite's blessing on Pygmalion extended to his art, allowing him to create works that touched the human heart as well as please the eye.
Love shaped by art, completed by the gods. The story of Pygmalion and Galatea has resonated through the centuries since it was first told in ancient times, capturing the imagination of artists, writers, and lovers who see in it a powerful expression of fundamental truths about art, love, and the human heart. At its surface, it is a fairy tale, a story about a wish granted and a miracle performed, the kind of happy ending that reality rarely provides. But beneath this surface lie deeper themes that explain why this particular story has endured when countless other myths have faded from memory. The story explores the relationship between creation and creator, asking what happens when an artist pours so much of themselves into their work that the line between art and life begins to blur. Pygmalion did not simply create a beautiful statue. He invested Galatea with all his hopes, his ideals, his capacity for love, and in doing so, he created something that demanded to be more than mere art. The miracle Aphrodite performed was, in one sense, simply making explicit what was already true. Galatea had been alive in Pygmalion's heart long before she drew her first breath, and the goddess's gift was to make the external reality match the internal truth. The transformation from obsession to genuine love represents another crucial theme in the narrative. Pygmalion's initial feelings for the statue were arguably unhealthy, a form of projection and control that allowed him to love without risk of rejection or disappointment. The statue could not disagree with him, could not reveal flaws or make demands, could not challenge his ideas or grow in unexpected directions. It was a safe object for his affections precisely because it was not real. But when Aphrodite granted life to Galatea, she fundamentally changed the nature of the relationship, transforming it from one of possession to one of genuine partnership. Galatea became a person with her own agency, her own thoughts and feelings, and loving her required Pygmalion to accept vulnerability and uncertainty, to give up control and allow her to be herself rather than simply a reflection of his ideals. This transformation suggests that true love requires us to love real people in all their complexity rather than idealized projections of our own making, and that the risk of vulnerability is what makes love meaningful. The story also addresses the theme of divine mercy and the willingness of the gods to intervene in human affairs when moved by genuine emotion. Aphrodite did not grant Pygmalion's wish
because he had earned it through piety or sacrifice, nor did she do it because he deserved special treatment. Rather, she was moved by the sincerity of his love, even though that love was directed in an unconventional and arguably inappropriate direction. The goddess recognized that beneath the strangeness of loving a statue lay a heart capable of deep devotion, a soul that longed for connection, even if it had initially sought that connection in the wrong place. Her miracle was an act of compassion, transforming what might have been a tragedy of permanent isolation into a story of fulfillment and joy. This suggests a worldview in which the gods, while powerful and sometimes capricious, are also capable of being moved by human emotion and of acting to alleviate suffering when they choose. The progression of the story, from Pygmalion's initial rejection of all mortal women through his creation of an ideal substitute and finally to his acceptance of a real relationship with a living woman who was more than his creation, represents a journey that many people can relate to even if they have never carved a statue. How many of us construct ideals in our minds, perfect partners who exist only in imagination, and then find ourselves disappointed when real people fail to match these impossible standards? How many of us prefer fantasy to reality because fantasy is controllable and safe, while reality is messy and unpredictable? Pygmalion's story suggests that this preference for the ideal over the real is ultimately unsatisfying, that the only path to genuine happiness lies in accepting and loving real people with real flaws, and that the gods themselves will sometimes intervene to teach us this lesson if we are open to learning it. The story also raises interesting questions about identity and autonomy that become more complex the more deeply we examine them. Was Galatea truly a new being, or was she in some sense already present in the statue, waiting for divine intervention to release her? When she came to life, did she possess innate characteristics that Aphrodite gave her, or was she shaped by Pygmalion's expectations and desires? As she developed her own personality and preferences, was this genuine independence, or simply the flowering of qualities that had always been latent? These questions, which the myth does not definitively answer, speak to larger philosophical issues about the nature of consciousness, free will, and the relationship between creator and created. In artistic terms, the story has served as inspiration for countless works across various media, from ancient pottery depicting the scene, to Renaissance paintings, to modern plays and films and novels. Each adaptation brings its own interpretation, sometimes emphasizing the romantic elements, sometimes focusing on the miraculous transformation, sometimes exploring the darker implications of a man who prefers his own creation to real women. The story's flexibility, its ability to be read in multiple ways depending on the perspective and concerns of the audience, helps explain its enduring appeal. In our own time, when questions about the nature of consciousness, the ethics of creation, and the relationship between art and life have taken on new urgency through developments in artificial intelligence and robotics, the story of Pygmalion and Galatea seems more relevant than ever. What responsibilities do creators have toward their creations? At what point does something created become someone rather than something? Can genuine relationship exist between creator and created, or is there always an inherent power imbalance that makes true equality impossible? These questions, which the ancient myth raises without necessarily answering, continue to challenge and provoke us. But at its heart, beneath all these layers of interpretation and analysis, the story of Pygmalion and Galatea remains what it has always been: a tale about the transformative power of love, about how devotion and desire can combine with divine favor to create miracles, and about how sometimes the heart can create what reality cannot provide, and if the gods are merciful, they make it real. It is a story that reminds us that perfection is less important than authenticity,
that control is less valuable than connection, and that the willingness to be vulnerable, to love something that can love you back and therefore has the power to hurt you, is what makes us fully human. Pygmalion learned these lessons through extraordinary means, through a miracle that no other mortal can expect to receive. But the lessons themselves are universal and accessible to everyone. We all must choose between the safety of fantasy and the risk of reality, between the perfection of our ideals and the messy beauty of actual human beings. And the story suggests that choosing reality, choosing vulnerability, choosing to love real people despite their imperfections is always the path to genuine happiness and fulfillment, even if no goddess appears to bless the choice with miracles.
And that's it for today's story about Pygmalion and Galatea. I really hope you enjoyed this beautiful myth as much as I did. If you haven't already, please make sure to leave a like and subscribe. It helps more than you know. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.